Do you know the difference between a fee-only investment advisor and one that is fee-based? Why don't commission-based investment advisors ever recommend an index fund? And what is the Series 65 exam anyway? Well, we'll answer those questions and more on this, the 99th episode of the DoughRoller podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. So today we're going to continue with the response to Frank's email. If you listen to the podcast number 98, you know that we were responding to an email I received from a listener who didn't want their name disclosed, so we're calling him Frank. And he was trying to figure out whether he should stick with his current investment advisor, who appears to be a commission-based financial advisor who's put him into some mutual funds, American funds, that have a sales charge and other fees that he's obviously not too fond of. And but he was getting some pushback when he was talking to his advisor about index funds and which would perform better. In episode 98, we covered the issue about dividends and how do dividends affect a performance, and are higher paying, are mutual funds with higher yielding dividends better than funds that perhaps have a lower dividend yield? And is there a relationship between the amount of dividends a fund pays to the shareholders and its cost? And so we kind of set the record straight on those sorts of issues in podcast 98. If you missed it, you can check it out, DoughRoller.net/podcast98. Today, we're going to kind of go to the second of what will be three podcasts in response to Frank's email. There was a lot to the email. And this one deals with understanding the difference between a commission based investment advisor and what's called a fee-only investment advisor. And I'm going to cover what I see as 5 really big problems with hiring a commission-based advisor. So that's what we're going to do today. Before we get to that, just a couple of housekeeping matters. One is, as I've mentioned, I've just been getting a flood of email, and I love it, and please keep them coming. But I've realized that my turnaround time to some of these emails has really gotten pretty bad. I think I'm about 12 days behind, and I hate that. It drives me crazy to have email in my inbox. It's like I want to get to them all, and but I'm doing the best I can. Again, if you don't hear from me, feel free to shoot me a reminder. But I do have all the email. I will get to them. One of the things that I'm going to start doing is, believe it or not, trying to produce more podcasts to address these questions. But I'm gonna sort of vary the way some of the podcasts work. I mean, up until now, the podcasts have generally been 30 to 45 minutes long, unless it's an interview. And then if it's an interview, it just depends on how the interview goes. Some are longer, and I'm going to vary that up a bit. There may be some podcasts that are just 10 or 15 minutes long, but they cover an important topic and one that I think might help you. Perhaps one that listeners emailed in about. And, there may not be a need to go for 30 or 45 minutes. And so 10 or 15 minutes gets the job done. And I may just stop there. Others might be more than an hour. It just depends on the topic. So I'm going to vary it up a bit. But in terms of getting back to you with the emails, just please be patient with me. I'm doing the best I can. And the second thing is I've got a number of things planned over the next 5 or 6 months that I think is going to really kind of change a lot about what I'm doing here on the podcast and with DoughRoller. And I'm looking forward to sharing those things with you. I can't really share them with you today, other than I will say this, and this is sort of just the tip of the iceberg, but I have signed up for it. I'm taking the Series 65 exam. Most of you right now are probably saying, Rob, I have no idea what the Series 65 exam is. That's okay. If you want to be a licensed, registered investment advisor, an RIA. There's a couple of different ways to do that, but one of them is to take the Series 65 exam, and it's basically an exam that tests whether you know what you're doing when it comes to managing other people's money for their investments. And so if you take the Series 65 exam, then you can file what is a lot of paperwork to get licensed to actually manage other people's money, other investments. And it's something that I've been given a lot of thought to, and it's something that I've decided to do. And the first step, of course, is to take the Series 65 exam. That one of the reasons I mention it today is what that will allow me to become is a fee-only investment advisor. Now, we're going to talk about that today. What is a fee-only investment advisor versus, say, a commission-based investment advisor? And then we're going to, as I said, we're going to cover what I view as several problems with commission-based advisors. Now, before I kind of go through the list of 5 today, and this, by the way, dovetails to Frank's email, because one of his questions was, should he stick with American funds and his commission-based investment advisor, or should he roll a 401k over into, say, for example, Vanguard? Now, I can't give Frank specific advice as to what he should do in terms of what investments he should make, whether he should in fact make the change or not. But I can lay out at least the things that I would consider if I were making that decision. But before I get to the list, I do want to say one thing. Commission brokers get beat up a lot in the press and on the internet and maybe even on this podcast from time to time. I actually know a number of commission-based brokers. I know a lot of them that are quite good and very smart. And frankly, I know some fee-only advisors that I wouldn't trust my money with. So I like so much in the world of investing and personal finance, this is not a black or white issue. There can be very good and very thoughtful and folks that really put their clients first and they charge based on a commission. And there can be fee-only advisors that frankly aren't very good. That being said, though, I do think there are some real issues that one ought to think through before they hire a commission-based investment advisor. For that matter, there are issues to consider before hiring a fee-only investment advisor. But today I want to focus, in light of Frank's email, on some of the concerns that I have with commission-based advisors and some of the things that I would consider if I were in the process of making a decision as to who to hire to manage my investments, okay? So we're going to cover 5 things. And the first is simply to straighten out some what I think is very confusing terminology. You'll hear references to fee-only investment advisors and fee-based investment advisors. And you might think, well, what in the world is the difference between the two? And are they really the same thing? You've got fee-only and fee-based on one side, and maybe commission-based advisors on the other. Well, I'm afraid not, and it's important to understand the difference. So the idea behind a fee-only investment advisor is that they will not get paid by the mutual fund companies, by the investments they're selling you. They're not going to get paid a commission from, again, a mutual fund or whatever other type of investment they might try to sell you. They're going to charge you a fee, but only you. And so the idea is they're not motivated to direct you into one investment over another. From their financial interests, it doesn't matter. Their fee, whatever it is going to be the same regardless of which mutual funds, which ETFs, which investment products you and your advisor ultimately decide are best for managing your money. That's a fee-only investment advisor. The term you'll hear is a registered investment advisor, an RIA. On the other side are commissioned or fee-based investment advisors. So when you hear the term fee-based, think commission, all right? And the idea here is these types of brokers or advisors can and do earn a commission from the products they are selling you. So, for example, we're going to talk about this. They will put you into mutual funds that charge what's called a load or a sales charge, and that's how they get paid. So the mutual fund company effectively pays the advisor for investing your money in their mutual fund. And so it's important as we walk through this to understand that difference, particularly as you're evaluating your own options. Don't be confused with the concept of fee-based. When you see fee-based, think commission. Now, the final thing I'll say about the confusing terminology is that you can have someone who does both, who has arrangements where they only charge their fee only, and other arrangements where they're commission-based. And so that kind of brings up an important point, and that is, as you're evaluating individuals you might want to work with, it's important for you to have a very detailed conversation with them about how they make money. How are they paid? Are they fee only? Are they fee based? If they're a little bit of both, what products do they sell that are fee based? What products do they sell that are just fee only? To understand exactly how they operate. So, unfortunately, it can be a bit confusing, and so that's the first of the 5 points I want to make today. You got to kind of wade through that, and hopefully understanding the terminology is a good first step. But you're going to have to do your due diligence. This is where you're going to have to take responsibility for your future, for your finances. If you listen to my podcast about how I've made a $100,000 retirement mistake, I could have sat back and blamed my accountant, and certainly some maybe mistakes were made. But I did my best to take responsibility for my part of that and understand how I can avoid that from happening again. And so, again, the point is you got to be proactive. You got to take responsibility and take the initiative to figure out exactly who you're hiring, how they'll make money. Are they fee only? Are they fee based? Are they a little bit of both? So that's the first thing. Now, sales charges. In the example that Frank provided in his email, we talked about this in podcast 98, but the mutual fund, the American fund, was ANCFX. We looked at that in Morningstar. I'm going to pull it up again. But one thing you'll notice when you look at this fund in Morningstar, or for that matter, any other financial website, you'll see something called the load. It's a sales charge. Now, in the case of this fund, American Funds Fundamental Investors A shares, you'll see a load or sales charge of 5.75%, and that's pretty common for A shares. That's effectively what the A share means, that it's front loaded. As opposed to maybe a back-end load. In other words, if you invest $100,000, if you have, say, a 401k and you hire a commission-based advisor, and they put you in ANCFX, and let's say it's an IRA, you've rolled over your 401k and you've invested whatever, $100,000, you will pay upfront $5,750 right off the top. That is a fee that you will pay. It's a fee that, among other things, provides the commission to your advisor. All right. So one of the things in evaluating this is you have to appreciate that's a significant fee, and it's going to come right off the top. And if you hire a commission-based advisor, they're going to put you in A shares of mutual funds. That's how they get paid. And you're going to pay that right off the top. Now, one of the things you may hear, and I think this is at least in theory a valid point, is the following. Yes, you'll pay 5.75% when you first invest in the fund, but that's it then. That money can stay in that fund for decades, and you won't pay your advisor anything else for the investments that are in that fund. In contrast, with a fee-only advisor, while you don't have that upfront charge, you do pay a percentage of assets under management, and you pay that year after year after year. Industry standard is 1%. Some advisors charge more than that. And so the point that you'll hear is, yes, you pay that 5.75% right off the bat, but in the long run, you'll actually pay less with a commission-based broker than you will with a fee-only advisor, because eventually, even if they're charging 1%, enough years go by, that's going to catch up and end up being more than the 5.75% that you paid off the top. There's some truth to that. However, there are some problems with that argument, something that I think you should consider if you're making this decision. And so imagine this. Imagine you go with a commission-based advisor. They put you in ANCFX. You pay your 5.75%, and you think that's good. Long term, I'll do better than paying a fee-only advisor. And then 4 years later, your advisor calls you up and says, I think we need to move the money out of ANCFX. Some things have changed. I think you've got a better investment, and so I'm going to suggest this other mutual fund with a load, 5.75%. So when you move your money, if you choose to do that, you're going to pay this commission, this sales charge all over again. Now, at this point, and trust me, this happens, and by the way, it may happen for legitimate reasons, but you're now going to be faced with, I think, a very difficult analysis. Is my advisor, does he or she really have my best interests at heart? Or is this to generate more fees for them? And even if they do have your best interest at heart, and I think many of them do, you still have to pay the 5.75% all over again. And so the argument that if you keep the money in one fund for the next 30 or 40 years, you'll end up paying less in fees than if you went with a fee-only advisor, all of a sudden goes out the window as you've moved your money to a different fund, or at least been presented with that possibility, and have to confront not only the issue of does my advisor have my best interest at heart, but even if he or she does, golly, do I want to spend another 5.75% just to invest in a different fund? On that score, I should also add that a fee-only advisor has a fiduciary responsibility to his or her clients. That is a very significant legal responsibility. It basically means that a fee-only advisor must put his or her client's interests ahead of theirs. They must recommend what they truly believe are the best investments for their clients, regardless of the fees that they may earn. For a commission-based or fee-based advisor, they do not have a fiduciary duty. It's a significant difference. Now, they do have a duty. That's not to say that they can just do whatever they want, and they have significant responsibilities, and they have to basically have a standard of care. They have to do a number of things, including making sure the investment's suitable for you and other things. So I don't mean to suggest that with a commission-based broker, it's the wild, wild west, but they do not have a fiduciary duty to their clients. And when you're confronted with these sorts of questions about do you move to a new fund and what are the sales charges going to be, and does my advisor, is he or she really looking out for my best interests, it's going to create a conflict that I think is simply antithetical to the relationship that should exist between a professional and his or her clients, and advising them on what are, let's be honest, these are really important decisions that can affect individuals and families' lives in significant ways. I think that conflict, that potential conflict, is just contrary to what we're trying to achieve. You see that in the sales charges, among other things. So that's number two. First, the confusing terminology. Second, the sales charges, which again don't end if you move your money from one fund to another at your advisor's recommendation. The third thing is fund selection. Because commissioned advisors are paid from these sales charges, these loads, they will put you into mutual funds that pay these loads. They will put you into funds offered by mutual fund companies that have these A shares that will charge 5.75% so that the advisor can get paid. So there's a problem with that goes beyond just the actual sales charge, the money that goes out of your pocket. And that is this: it eliminates from consideration a lot of investments. For example, you won't have a commission-based advisor putting you in index funds like at Vanguard or Fidelity or any of the other mutual fund companies that offer index funds. Why? Because they don't charge a load that the sales charge that can be used to pay the advisor's fee. And so with commissioned advisors, there are these, really a whole host of what I think are great investments that are basically off the table. Now, the reverse isn't true, by the way. That is not to say that a fee-only advisor would put you in a front-loaded mutual fund, but certainly a fee-only advisor can and will recommend things other than index funds. I sing the praises of index funds, but as you know, if you've listened to the show, I'm not one to say that actively managed funds should never be considered. And in fact, as I mentioned in the last episode, I own shares of Dodge & Cox International Stock Fund, which is an actively managed fund. And so with a fee-only advisor, you're not going to simply brush off the table all actively managed funds, and there may be times when, with a diversified portfolio, it makes sense to use some actively managed funds. In my view, index funds should be the core of a portfolio, but I certainly wouldn't eliminate from consideration other types of investments. And I think with commission-based advisors, that's oftentimes what happens. So again, the sales charge, not only is it the expense that you have to deal with and the potential conflict it creates with your advisor, but then it eliminates investment options. And it goes back to the fiduciary duty and that conflict. Why if someone were coming to me for my advice for investments, I don't know how I'd look them in the eye and say, well, by the way, because of my own interests, there are all these options out there that I'm not even going to tell you about. I just don't think that's the right way to advise folks. So that's the third concern I would have with a commission-based advisor. The fourth issue it's similar to the third one, but it's different. Rather than with the third issue, we talked about they may not even consider certain investments. The fourth issue is they oftentimes run to certain very expensive investments that I think most people have no business buying. And in fact, I was talking to a very good friend of mine who, in fact, just got his CFA, a chartered financial analyst, a very difficult designation to achieve. It takes quite a long time. Very smart guy, has a degree in finance, and he worked for commission-based advisors before. He doesn't now. And one of the things he told me, he said, Rob, because I asked him, I said, so do they also do fee-only arrangements? And he said, oh, yeah, they do. They'll do both. This was, one of those situations where they were fee-only and fee-based. And I said, well, if they're managing client assets on a fee-only basis, and if they're doing a good job and they build up their assets under management, isn't that enough? Why not just stick with fee-only? Certainly they can make a really good living doing that. And he said, yeah, but they don't. He said the commissions on certain products are so high that they just immediately go to that and sell clients things like very expensive variable annuities, things like very expensive non-traded REITs. And he said, they're getting, they might get a client to put $1 million in an expensive variable annuity, and they'll make 7% right off the top. $70,000 comes right in the door, and they're making that kind of money, and it's just hard to say no to. I mean, it almost sounded like a drug. And, again, this is not to say that all variable annuities are bad or that folks should never consider or buy into variable annuities, because I don't believe that. I think they are appropriate investments in certain circumstances, although I tend to focus on the low-cost ones, not the ones that pay huge commissions to advisors. And for that matter, non-traded REITs actually can be good investments too. They're not, as the name suggests, and I don't want to go into non-traded REITs today, but they're not very liquid. But actually, being willing to accept that risk can actually increase your returns if it's a good investment. So again, the point isn't to say that these are always bad options, but I think for most people, most of the time, they are unnecessary and oftentimes sold by brokers making really, really big fees from these sales. All right, that's the fourth one. The fifth one is what I call the total return myth. And here's how it goes. In talking to a commission-based advisor, they may say, look, yes, there's a sales charge up front. Yes, we're investing in actively managed funds, so the yearly expense ratio is higher. But what you really need to worry about and be concerned with is the total return after expenses. That's ultimately what we're after. So even if expenses are higher, if the investments perform better and your total return after expenses is higher, then who cares what the fees are, right? Well, again, there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly our concern is ultimately the total return after fees. I would say also after taxes, right? But yeah, that's what we're concerned with, total return. So if I kind of agree with that, what's the problem? Well, there are a couple of problems. First of all, the history books tell us that actively managed funds over decades, rarely beat, certainly in U.S. Funds, say the S&P 500 index. They rarely beat the S&P 500 index. And we can go back and look at the history books, and you will find a couple that do over 10 years, 15 years, maybe 20. It gets a little skewed because when you go back too far, there are so many funds that no longer exist. So when the funds go out of business, they kind of get dropped from the scorecard. But if you were to include all of the defunct mutual funds, the results would actually look even worse. But the fact is, particularly in very efficient markets like what we have in the United States, very few actively managed funds beat the S&P 500 after expenses, and I'll say after taxes if it's in a taxable account, over the long term. So that's the first problem. Second problem is, could there be some that over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years beat the S&P 500? Sure, it could happen. I have no idea which ones will do it. Do you? I don't. How can any of us know that? We can't. I suppose we could say, well, let's pick the mutual fund that's done the best for the longest and just hope that it continues to do well for the next 20, 30, or 40 years. I don't think that's a very sound way to make investment decisions. As I mentioned in the last show, I kind of got out of what was at the time a very good mutual fund, Legg Mason Value Trust, run by Bill Miller, because of that very conclusion. Yes, he had a great track record. Yes, he's a very smart man. I think a very good money manager. But it's just tough to beat the S&P 500 over the long term after fees and after taxes. And sure enough, Legg Mason Value Trust stopped doing that actually in a very big way. That's the second problem with the total return myth. The third thing is, and this is something to keep in mind, this idea of total return after expenses. So when you look at the performance of a mutual fund, on Google Finance, Yahoo Finance, I'm looking at Morningstar, the performance is after fees. So for example, for the American Funds Fundamental Investors A-Share, ANCFX, they have an expense ratio of 63 basis points. The performance numbers that they show are after those expenses are subtracted. And that's true whether it's an actively managed fund, an index fund, a fund with an A shares of a fund that charge a load. Their performance numbers are after the expense ratios are deducted, and for that matter, after all of the trading costs are deducted, which are not reflected in the expense ratios, as we've mentioned. However, and this is the point I want to make, they do not factor in the sales charges. They do not factor in the 5.75%. And if you think about it, how could they? The calculation would be virtually impossible because you'd have to know how long a specific investor held the investment to figure out exactly the impact of that sales charge. And obviously, sites like Morningstar can't do that. So as you're looking at performance numbers, and if you're talking to an advisor that kind of makes this argument that it's the total return, make sure you keep that in mind and talk to them about it. The sales charge is not reflected in the performance numbers. The fourth thing that I want to mention, and really this sort of kind of brings all of this full circle when we talk about fee-only versus fee-based, and should you pay the 5.75 up front versus perhaps paying 1% to a fee-only advisor, is this. Most fee-only advisors, at least all of the ones that I know, and I know a number of them, and I've read a lot about how they, the approach that most registered investment advisors, fee-only advisors, take, is that low-cost index funds are a big part of their investment strategy, right? So oftentimes the weighted average cost of the funds that a fee-only advisor will put you into are lower than the weighted average expense ratios of the funds that a commissioned broker will put you in. Now, I'm sure that's not universally true. And so, again, this is where you need to be proactive and understand exactly their investment philosophy and their attitude towards costs. But the point is this, you could be paying easily 50 basis points or more extra a year just for the costs of the underlying costs of the funds they put you into. Because remember, when you pay whether you have a commissioned only advisor or a fee only investment advisor, their fees are over and above the underlying costs of the funds themselves. You're still going to have whatever the expense ratios are for the funds that you're in, whether it's a mutual fund or an ETF. You're still going to be responsible for the trading costs that these funds incur, just like you would. It's no different than if you were investing on your own. Obviously, the costs of the fund, the expense ratio, is going to come out of your returns. Well, that's true as well with a fee only and a fee based advisors. But again, with fee-only advisors, you're oftentimes put into funds that are significantly less expensive. Remember, the fee-only advisor doesn't have to pick A shares. They don't have to pick actively managed funds so that they can get their commission, right? They have, frankly, a broader spectrum of investment options to choose from. And in fact, at least as far as I'm concerned in my investment approach, if I were managing someone else's investments, I would view it as my responsibility and duty to be able to execute the investment plan that I would have worked out with my client for the least amount of costs possible. And that would include, among other things, picking the lowest cost mutual funds that met the goals and requirements of the investment plan. Well, I know I've thrown a lot at you. Now, one of the things I would say is if you're considering a commission-based advisor or broker, kind of walk through these issues with them. They may have responses. You may still be comfortable with them. Maybe it's someone you know. So that's a decision that you'll have to make. What's best for you and the investments that you have, and so forth. But I think these are kind of items that you ought to, kind of go down the list. I would talk to them. I'd say, well, how am I going to know if you come to me 4 years from now, I want to switch funds? Am I going to pay another 5.75%? And how am I going to work through that issue? How are you and I going to work through that issue? Do you consider index funds? Maybe some of them will. Maybe that someone will say, yes, for the index funds, I'll charge you fee only. And for actively managed funds, A shares, I'll charge you commission-based. I don't know what the answers are going to be. But I do think as you're figuring out what's best for you, these are questions that you should be asking. Well, there you go. If you have any questions about this, as always, don't hesitate to email me, even if it takes me, a week or 10 days to get back to you. And I apologize for that. I'm doing the best I can, but don't hesitate to email me, dr@doughroller.net, about this or anything. And as always, you can get the show notes to this episode where I'll tick off these 5 items that I've kind of run through so you can see them in writing if you want. It's podcast 99, so doughroller.net/podcast 99. And you know what that means? That means the next time I get behind this mic, it's going to be episode 100. I got to do something big for episode 100. I don't know what I'm going to do. By the way, 2 days from today is my 26th wedding anniversary. I can't believe she's put up with me for that long. She deserves some kind of award, some big time, to put up with me for 26 years. In 2 days, my 26th wedding anniversary. And it dovetails with the 100th episode of this podcast. And in case you were wondering, no, I will not be recording the 100th episode on my anniversary. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.